Hey, wanted to talk about something today that isn't going to affect you today. It's going to affect you 2 years from now, 3 years from now. Team 17 just announced that they're going to do restructuring and have some layoffs. Team 17 is a publisher. You might know them from Worms or Overcooked. Often these kind of publishers, they have a successful game like Worms, realize they can only make so many games themselves. So what do we do with all this money? Because we have like tens of millions of dollars. They're like, we can become publishers, and they start to publish. But as that space gets competitive, they often try to grow quickly. And so we've seen things like tinyBuild and Devolver became publicly traded companies on the UK stock market. You would ask why the UK stock market? Well, I think that you ask that question means you know the answer, right? There's a reason why the U.S. stock markets are considered kind of the high end of that system, whether you like it or not. But like their stocks are down 95%, 93%, something like that, like just being slaughtered, right? Because all of this was happening like during the pandemic. We see all this up. And again, that bet that, hey, this just means gaming is going to the next plateau, even though it's already gigantic. This is going to take it the rest of the way, right? We saw this with Unreal, admitting like, hey, we had all this growth during the pandemic, and then that slowed, and the way it slowed didn't slow into the higher earning things. Because people are worried about the economy, so they're not spending money. Right, Sega just canceled Hyenas recently. Now, that was a questionable game. Any game that go woke, go broke is like your tagline. Yeah, I don't know what you're doing, but just still, like they're removing risk, right? They're trying to get out of that, right? And so some of this is we're seeing the platforms themselves see less value in the smaller indies, right? If you look at Game Pass or PlayStation, people don't talk about it as like a bunch of upcoming small games. They're like, what are the tentpoles? What are the big things, right? And this is why we have Microsoft buying Activision, right? So some of that is the press coverage itself, right? Because they'll be like, oh, Microsoft's got a hole in their Game Pass schedule, and then just ignore all these really cool indie games because they don't see that as the value of the big sell, right? And so that's gotten it. But the other thing is how things like Game Pass pay you out, right? It's a licensing deal, and you get some money if your game does really well, but not the normal upside, right? Like normally, if you had this giant hit, you would have this big chunk of money, then you'd be like, oh my God, we're going to start a publishing company, right? But those publishers relied on that big upside because they would have 5 games and then one, whoa, and that was all the money, and that money would fund all the others, right? This is the same thing we're seeing with a lot of investors have moved into this space, or did, and now they're also a little cold, though. There's a couple trying some different things. Because as these publishers got all freaked out, they started pulling back their money, right? Because again, if you think about it, you're a publisher, you're going to spend, let's say, $3 million on 5 games, that's $15 million. Out of those 3 are going to lose you money, one's going to break even, and one's going to be this big hit. But now, let's just say it costs you $3 million, and all you've signed with, I'm going to make up numbers. These are made up numbers, do not pretend I'm saying real numbers. Game Pass, and you're going to be like, we're going to get $1 million for going on Game Pass. And then we're going to sell it on other platforms. But Game Pass cannibalizes those other sales. And they're slower. And your Game Pass is a super big hit there. Man, like people on Game Pass love it. But you only get the $1 million for going on Game Pass or whatever. Right? Again, that's not a real number. Don't. But just for comparison. So all of a sudden that big hit, that one of the 5 of their 15 million portfolio doesn't earn them $40, $50 million. It earns them $5 million, right? The upside just isn't there, and that's impacting the industry in a way that's making publishers scared. Now you can say, don't publish on Game Pass. That's a good idea. I like Game Pass though, right? So for a lot of people, it's still the right idea. Don't get me wrong. We're on Game Pass, yeah. But right, it's freezing these small publishers where they're like, we don't know what to do next. We had the game plan before. We would take someone who was fairly unknown. We would put them in front of PlayStation and Microsoft. They would sign one of those deals that would actually recoup our costs in risk, and then we could defray it that way, or we would get big upside going on like 3 platforms. Again, when you take that upside away, you add a lot of risk because now all of a sudden you can't have those failing games. They all need to break even so that your one hit can fund everything else. But even that's not funding everything else, right? And so there are still indie hits. There are still indie hits that are doing really well, especially independent people. When they get something in one of these deals, like that success can still be meaningful, right? But for these mid-sized publishers, right, and there's a whole bunch. I'm using Devolver and tinyBuild and Team 17, but like there is a whole ton here, right? From Humble Bundle to there's a whole bunch. Curve, Sumo, like there's a whole bunch of people in this space that now have to be at Raw Fury, right? Again, I can just keep going. There's a million of them, but a lot of them are really scared because they don't know how they can make their money back. So then they got to be like, we need to find the surefire hit. Here's the problem with the surefire hit. You don't know the surefire hit unless the prototype's gone long enough that you know the surefire hit. But then how's those people getting funded? Well, those companies are now getting funded because that's where some of the investors realized, oh, we can give you too little money and make you go to a publisher. It's like make that as part of the deal. And then we get our little piece, and like it's all just beating down these little devs, right? And they're splitting up their money and they're splitting up who's going to be the profit, who's going to win. Because none of these people care if you win. They care if their portfolio wins, right? That is always the thing when you deal with investors or publishers. I think publishers actually care if individuals win more, and investors care if individuals win. And I'm friends with investors, and they're nice people. But at the end of the day, they look back and they go, how did our portfolio do? That's what we care about. And so that not understanding that the portfolio's spikiness doesn't exist anymore is going to have a big impact on the industry. And it's going to have a big impact on the kind of games that get made and the kind of games that you're going to see in 2 and 3 years when stuff isn't funded this year. You're going to see that expressed. And this is something we think about, right? We've talked about that, hey, there's going to be a game 2 from Stray Bombay. How do we go about it? Do we go about publisher? Do we go out and try to raise more money? Do we go to Kickstarter? Do people still do Kickstarters? That's an honest question. I should have led with that because no one's awake anymore. I could say anything. I take my clothes off at this point. No one's going to see this. But seriously, it's a question. I may be able to do a whole video on Kickstarter. But like, how do you have these alternate funding? Because I always like to step back and think, go, not how does everyone do it, but what aren't they doing? What's the weird and funny thing we can try and do? I don't know right now. And right now we are just caring about launching 1.0 of the Anacrusis. That is our focus. That is what we will work on. But we are going to be lifting our heads soon and start going, what's next and how do we fund that? And man, all these little closures of these little publishing houses are more meaningful than you realize. And they're going to have a giant impact on the games you play again, not this year, but 2-3 years from now. It is going to have a huge impact.